In this lesson, we'll talk about some of the functionality of our sculpting brushes. So let's go ahead and jump back in here. So again, here is our smooth subdivided creature base mesh. So if we go ahead and select it, you can see we've got currently 5 subdivision levels on it. Now the goal is to take something like this, a base mesh, and our goal would be to come in and create something with a little bit more detail. So in this case, something from that shape, we could get something like this, where you've gone in and sculpted the sort of muscles and maybe where the eyes go and some of the areas where the mouth are, and be able to create your creature that way. And then at the end, you'll be able to bake out maps that you can use on a lower res piece, maybe not the level that we created, but maybe one higher or so. Bake maps out for those to be able to recreate this and animate it, make it move around. I mean, that's really the goal. We're creating something to be able to be used in a film or in a game or whatever project we happen to be using. That's really the goal, unless we're creating just kind of a still image. So to be able to get from this, we need to use our sculpting brushes. And so let's go ahead and take a look at how we can do that. So the first one that we're going to look at is just pull. So let's go ahead and activate pull. You can see we have some attributes down here. We have settings, fall off, stamp, symmetry, and stencil. We're not going to talk about stamp or stencil yet. We'll touch on symmetry and fall off, but let's start with settings. So if we take a look at our settings, you can see we have some buttons up here for linking the size, pressure, and symmetry. This will allow us to link these settings and values across different brushes. So if we don't have those clicked, we can change and have a different brush size for every brush. You can see as I hover over the model, we get an orange circle with sort of a little orange hill inside of it. Okay, that little hill is the fall off, and the circle is the size of our brush. So we're using pull, so if I just stroke across the surface, it's going to pull that geometry out. Okay, and we're working at level 5, so you can see we get kind of a nice smooth stroke. If we want to actually push in instead of pulling out, we can hold down Control while we stroke, and it will actually push it into the surface. So whatever you are using, you can go ahead and invert that by using Control, which is a very quick way of working. The size of the brush is determined here. Our size is set to 20. I can go ahead, middle mouse drag sideways, and I can change the size. In this case, I'm using a Wacom tablet, but if you're using a mouse, you can middle mouse drag sideways to change the brush size. You can see the little vertical indicator with the circle on the end of it, the little vertical line. That's actually the pressure. So right now it's set to 20%, but if I middle mouse drag up and down, I can change that pressure interactively. So using your middle mouse, you can quickly change the brush size and pressure to change how your brush stroke affects the model. You can also, again, hold down Control at any time for any stroke, and it'll invert that. Now, as you're sculpting, you may want to go back and smooth some geometry out. So relax it, smooth it back down. Well, you can do that with your brushes selected by just holding down Shift. So if I've sculpted something and now I want to smooth it back in, I can hold down Shift, and then as I stroke over that, you can see it smooths it back out. To be able to resculpt, all I have to do is release Shift, and I can go back in and sculpt, hit Shift again, smooth it out. So that's going to be something you're really going to get used to, is going in, doing some sculpting, maybe smoothing a little bit of it out, maybe feathering the edges a little bit, smoothing it back into the surface, and so forth. Okay. Now right now the draw mode is set to freehand, which means I can just kind of draw a line around. So what's actually happening is we're actually taking a stroke and it's blending in across this line. So if I turn on spacing and I increase that amount, you can see that it starts to turn into dots. And so you can actually see that it's placing that dot and that dot and that dot. Okay, and by taking this spacing off, it's blending it all so it looks like one model, one smooth line rather. I can go ahead and increase the pressure, and let me decrease the size here. Okay, and you can see that dot. Now the fall off is that little hill that you see inside that indicator, inside the icon. So we'll go to fall off, and think of this as the center of our brush, and it falls off towards the outer, so it kind of eases out to the outside. But you can modify this if you want to. If you want to make it sharper, you can go ahead and modify this curve. So we can control click on the curve, and that'll give me a new point, and I can change the fall off. So maybe I want it to be a little bit sharper. And so now, as I come in here, you can see the difference, okay, this versus this. Okay, it's staying up higher longer, and then it's falling off very quickly, so we get a sharper edge there. We can also come in and modify this if we want to be even sharper. Now, if you don't like that, you want to go back to the original, you can always go in and reset the fall off and take it back here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and turn back off spacing, and that gives you your nice smooth line. Now we also have under draw mode the ability to use drag rectangle and drag dabs. We don't really need to talk about this too much yet, but drag dabs means I just click and then I can drag an instance of that brush. And if you're using something like a stamp, that'll be maybe a little bit more useful. A drag rectangle we'll talk about also a little bit later. Okay, so I'm going to go just back to freehand. If I invert this, you can see that now the default is that I'm pushing it in to the surface. If I hold down Control now, I'll pull it out. So it just basically inverts the functionality of the brush. Okay, if at any time you change a lot of these settings here and you want to take it back to the default, you can always just reset that, and it'll reset everything back the way it was. Okay, so just remember your middle mouse back and forth and up and down. You can change your size and also your pressure. The spacing you probably don't need to worry about unless you're working with stamps, but that is something to think about. And also the fact that you can smooth out by using the Shift key, and also invert your brush stroke using the Control key. Okay, now one more thing to talk about is symmetry. So we've talked about some of these settings. Also the preview mode, which doesn't really affect too much, but you can see right now as I turn across the brush is actually turning across the surface and kind of gives me a good indication of the angle. I can change this preview mode to off, which doesn't give me any sort of preview, or I can change it to screen, which you can see basically it's always facing me. I usually like to keep it on surface just because it makes more sense, and as I'm going in sculpting, it makes more sense to me. Okay, so let's jump into the symmetry tab here, and we can turn on our symmetry, and that's basically being able to sculpt on both sides. So if I hit Alt X, I can turn on the symmetry in the X, and you can see that activated here, so that as I sculpt, it's sculpted across this X axis. If I want to change this to X, or to Y rather, I can change it to Y or Z, or I can have multiple axes selected at one time. Okay, so you can see that there. So if you're working on something like a face or a creature, a lot of times they're going to be fairly symmetrical, at least at the beginning, and so you can use symmetry here to actually activate that. Okay, and I can turn that off with just Alt and whatever axis. So Alt X, I can turn that off. Alt Z, turn that off as well. So now I'm not working with symmetry. And if you want to have symmetry on all the brushes that you're working with, so if you want to change brushes, you want to make sure to keep that symmetry, then you can turn on this link symmetry button right here. Just make sure that that is checked. Okay. One last thing to talk about really quickly is the fact that you can modulate your size and pressure by coming in here. There's an effector. You can actually modulate that based on your pen pressure, okay, based on the pen tilt. You can do it based on the distance, so you can have it fall off. Let's say I want the size to fall off based on the distance. So you can see if I drag across here, I get this cool little taper. Okay, I'm not doing anything special. I'm just dragging across, but as it gets to that distance, it tapers down that size. So that's something that you can change there as well, and you can modify the pressure in the same way. All right, we'll talk more about steady stroke in a future lesson, but I just wanted to go over some of the basic settings of our brushes, some of the basic attributes that we can change. And a lot of these are going to be fairly common, the size, the pressure, spacing, things like that. Some of them are going to be slightly different, and we'll talk about those as we get to them. Okay, so let's go ahead, now that we've got kind of an idea of what these sculpt brushes are going to do, let's go ahead in the next lesson actually start to build our creature, or we're going to use this as an example, but obviously this isn't what we want our creature to look like. So in the next lesson, let's take a look at using not only pull, but also we'll add a couple to the mix. So we'll add grab, we'll talk about grab, and we'll also add smooth and erase, and we'll talk about those. So eventually we'll get to all of these, but let's go ahead and start to add just a couple more on to talk about in the next lesson.